Hello, thank you for viewing this podcast of a talk by Phoebe Merrick on the Poor Law and its administration, particularly in relation to Romsey. It's one of 4 such talks given by the Hampshire Archives Trust and the Hampshire Field Club for the Community Archive Forum, which has been running now for several years. Phoebe tells me that she first discovered local history in 1969 and has become more and more addicted. She has an MPhil from the University of Southampton on ullage, a taxation which was applied in the Middle Ages to textiles, and she followed up the subject with an MA from the University of Winchester. She's been chairman of the Romsey Local History Group. She was chairman of the Local History Group at Romsey for 20 years. She's also made a massive study of Dr. John Latham, his works which are in the British Museum. She's now produced a 4-volume work on it, so I recommend that you have a look at that. Anyway, Phoebe, you'll now be telling us about the Poor Law records of Romsey, and I will hand over to you and ask you to hand back when you've finished. Thank you very much.
Managing the poor has always been a problem for the better off. A balance has to be struck between allowing the poor to die of cold and starvation, or worse, from communicable diseases brought on by their poverty on the one hand, and not keeping them in a degree of comfort that is perceived to encourage idleness on the other. This dilemma is something that has concerned the better off across many centuries and has not been resolved to this day. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the Victorian solution, which started with the New Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, and which completely changed the way in which the poor were looked after, using material from the records of the Romsey Union. The slides are illustrative of what is available, so may not all be readable in the time they are on screen. The illustrations are drawn from material at the National Archives and at Hampshire Record Office, from pictures held by the Romsey Local History Group and tables that I have compiled. Now, from Tudor times, each parish had been responsible for its own poor, often providing buildings to house them in and with arrangements to feed and clothe them. Problems arose because the poor were not evenly distributed across the country, and some parishes had many while others had few in relation to their overall population. The New Poor Law Act of 1834 grouped parishes into unions managed by elected boards of guardians who were responsible for the management of the poor. Every parish, no matter how small, had at least one guardian and thus was represented on the relevant board. The boards of guardians had the power to levy rates with which to meet their costs. Each union was required to provide a workhouse in which the poor could be housed. In the case of Romsey Extra, which is the area outside the historic core of the town, already had a suitable building in use as a poorhouse, and this became the Union Workhouse. This building in Coopenham, beside the road to Winchester, was later called the Gardens, and has remained as a place of shelter ever since. The properties in which the poor had been housed in other parishes were disposed of. MH is a reference from the National Archives, by the way. The New Poor Law intended that all those whose means were inadequate would be housed in their local workhouse, although exceptions were made for the old and for the impotent poor. The report that led to the Act stated that, except as to medical attendance, all relief whatever to able-bodied persons or to their families, otherwise than in well-regulated workhouses, shall be declared unlawful and shall cease. Thus, 2 categories of paupers were created: those who were housed in the workhouse and receiving indoor relief, and those living in their own homes and receiving outdoor relief. In order to deter the unjustifiable use of the workhouses, conditions were to be harsh. Amounts of food are interesting. It is estimated that most individual labourers, such as agricultural labourers, ate about 122 ounces of solid food per week. Workhouses provided between 137 and 182 ounces, while men in prison received 292 ounces of solid food per week. Hence the need to make the food dreary so its provision did not attract those who should support themselves. On the whole, conditions, particularly in the early days, were dire. Those able to work were required to do so, for example, in the laundry, in the kitchen, or in the gardens surrounding the house, or making clothes for wear in the house. Many of the buildings were inadequately heated, and no provision for entertainment was made. No books, no toys for the children, for example. Now, I have not found the details of the conditions in Romsey, so I don't know if that applied here. From 1892, independently elected guardians were replaced in rural areas by the members of the newly created rural district councils. Thus, each RDC met in two capacities, one as a council and one as the Board of Guardians. In Romsey, the RDC was supplemented by elected guardians from the borough when it met to administer the poor law. In 1830, boards of guardians were abolished and their roles passed to the county councils. Then in 1948, the whole system was swept away by the new national insurance and national health provisions. Records of workhouse and poor administration for Romsey since 1834 survive primarily in two places. One of these is the National Archives at Kew, where they're prefixed NH, and the other is at Hampshire Record Office in Winchester. In fact, sorry, MH, not N. In fact, so many records survive that it is easy to be overwhelmed by them. Colin Moretti has looked at the material at Kew, and I'm grateful to him for making his research available to me. One of the major sources is held under MH12, which consists of the correspondence relating to each workhouse as sent either to the Poor Law Board or its successor, the Local Government Board. Also available at Kew are such items as lists of employees of the various workhouses and plans of workhouse buildings. That slide I hadn't expected at this point, never mind. My researches have been confined to material in the Hampshire Record Office. A major find, and which has not given any publicity in anything I have read, has been that of the monthly printed lists of paupers, including by name those who were receiving outdoor relief, who was in the workhouse, and who was being supported by guardians in an asylum. They are headed outdoor relief. Not all of them have survived, but there is a selection from across the decades, from the 1830s to the 1890s for the Romsey Union, and they give a real insight into the administration on the ground. They are not catalogued in a consistent way at the Hampshire or any other record office that I have checked, because they are not recognised as a discrete class. Finding them involves guessing what keywords to put into a catalogue search. Out relief and variants thereof is a good way to start. Some unions have many survivors of these records, while many others have none. These returns have the potential for many explorations into the lives of the very poor. Apart from the statistical analyses, they can provide the basis of studies of individual families taken with other materials such as census returns. They also raise questions about family structure. For example, the death of a workman may bring into the system not only his widow and children, but also his aged parents. The best study of this group of records is being made at York by the Clements Hall Local History Group, and here's the link in case you want to follow that up. As the 19th century progressed, more information was included on these sheets, such as statistical summaries of the constituent parishes, including financial material as it related to the union. In addition to these returns, the collection in HRO includes 2-minute books of the Romsey Guardian, covering between them the years 1851 to 1863. There is also a book listing those who died in the workhouse, giving their home parish and the cause of their death. Such then is the material I've had to work with. I have not undertaken much research into the Guardians themselves, although Mr. May, chairman, speaking in the 1850s, compared the early difficulties experienced in administering the new Poor Law with the quiet character of the present time. Formerly, it was only under the protection of the police that guardians could attend their duties free from violence. Since then, striving to destroy the innate principle of pauperism, the amount given as relief was at least 50% less, and he would ask, were the poor worse off? On the contrary, with the exception of isolated cases, the poor were happier because dependent on their own exertions. The guardians had to manage the workhouse, distribute relief to the poor living in their own homes, answer to the relevant authority in London, and later were tasked with other duties in regard to sanitary matters and school attendance. Money had to be found for these services, including the salaries and wages of those who carried out the administrative work on behalf of the guardians. So far as I can see, each parish was charged with its share of the expense based on its proportion of the rateable value of the whole union, and it was up to each parish to collect and remit the money due. Records were kept showing how much money was paid by each parish and how much was expended thereon, so it is possible to see which parishes were net beneficiaries and which were net contributors, although the presence of vagrants distorted the figures. The cost of provisions for the workhouse was ongoing, as was the cost of bread, and money distributed to those receiving out relief and the wages of employees. For example, in the half year to March 1879, the Guardians spent nearly £2,500, just over 2,000 of it on relief. The other major expense of the Guardians was the rates they had to pay for county and police services based on the rateable value of the workhouse. Now the mouse isn't working. Oh dear. Yes it is. Many supplies for the workhouse were obtained by public tender, and the amounts paid were in the public domain, although the workhouse was partially self-sufficient. The grounds around the house were used as a market garden, which grew vegetables, and pigs were kept and sometimes sold. The largest expense for food was in the purchase of bread. The Guardians provided much bread for those on out relief in the form of £4 loaves, and the cost of these loaves made an enormous difference to the costs incurred. In the 1840s, bread had varied between 16 and 20 pence per gallon, which provided an £8 loaf. By 1851, the cost was much lower at 8 pence or 9 pence per gallon, so economies could be made, and also the cost of other provisions had fallen. Mostly the poor were provided with £4 loaves, and between 1858 and 1880, the cost per loaf varied between 3pence 3 farthings and 6pence halfpenny, depending on the year and the parish. The staff employed by the Guardians included their clerk, the master and matron of the workhouse, an assistant matron, a chaplain, a medical officer, a porter, a cook, and a nurse. Some of these posts had been added in the years since the workhouse opened in 1836. The outdoor staff included 5 medical officers who were local doctors, 2 relieving officers, a collector of the Guardians, 2 inquiry officers, and 2 school attendance officers. I have not determined exactly who did what, who was full-time and who was part-time, nor when the posts were created. Generally, rates of pay by Guardians, not only in Romsey but across the country, were low. Needless to say, this resulted in the employment of many people who were not adequate. An example of how the Guardians treated their employees was shown by the way in which they dealt with their porter. In 1851, he had been absent for 3 or 4 weeks due to illness, and because his absence was not causing problems with vagrants, it was decided to dispense with the post for the summer, and the man was given a fortnight's notice. By contrast, the workhouse master, who had been pestering the schoolmistress, was allowed to resign. One of the problems that exercised the minds of Guardians across the country was eligibility. Each union was only responsible for caring for paupers who had settlement in their area, and much time and expense was incurred in bringing ineligible claimants. At the beginning of the century, there were enormous arguments between Romsey Infra and Romsey Extra on the subject. Settlement could be achieved by birth, apprenticeship, payment, or in the case of women, marriage, but not widowhood. After 1846, residence of at least 5 years in a parish was deemed to give settlement. Later, the qualifying time was cut. The people who obtained settlement in this way were classified as irremovable and were assigned to the district rather than to a parish. Thus, the expense of maintaining them was classed under the general expenses of the union. A few paupers were supported by their home unions, although they lived elsewhere. For example, Peter Genvey, aged 81, was supported by the Romsey Guardians and lived in South Stoneham. This all sounds straightforward enough, but people's lives are messy, and a liability could lead to considerable disputes between unions and to a considerable body of case law. Consider, for example, the boy named Snellgrove, whose case arose in November 51. His settlement was acknowledged to be in Alderbury Union, but he had been employed at East Dean, so eligible in Romsey Union. He was returned to Alderbury, then he took a job at Eldon, which was in the Stockbridge Union, but lost it because the Stockbridge guardians would not buy him the clothes he needed. Pressure was put on those receiving out relief to come into the workhouse where, as the minutes of the Guardians recorded, the religious discipline, superior order, propriety and comfort, which the house affords to its aged inmates, make it preferable to the crowded hovels and the pestilential influences which therein continue to demoralize their days. It was noted that in 1850 there had been 51 applications for admission to the workhouse. The number of indoor poor was 74 and outdoor poor was 528, so 602 in all, which is rather more than the number in 1898 or in most of the decades that followed 1851. Generally speaking, there were between 350 and 400 names on each of the printed lists. These names are of each individual in the workhouse or asylum and of each family unit receiving outdoor relief. So working out the total number receiving support is not entirely straightforward. In 1891, the total population within the Romsey Union was 10,901. And during the year, 1,014 people received relief from the Guardians. Of these, 526, just over half, were vagrants. The official returns stated that just over 4% of the population was in receipt of relief. I will now look at some aspects of workhouse life. Children, for example. How to manage children who came into the system was a continuing challenge. The objective was to fit them to be self-sufficient in adult life. For this reason, the Guardians employed a schoolmaster for the boys and a schoolmistress for the girls to give them a basic education. Some 20 years before compulsory universal education was introduced. One problem was that the children had been so institutionalized that they did not know the dynamics of normal household life. This was particularly a problem for girls who went into service, never having seen a domestic kitchen. It was reported that in the 10 years to 1861, 59 youngsters had left Romsey Workhouse for employment. A few were returned for misconduct and others for unstated reasons. Thus, of the 59, 26 were unfit to make their way in the world. Later, the Guardians preferred to board children out, which left them better fitted for living in the community. The largest identifiable group in any workhouse consisted of the elderly, many of whom were there for some years, and as might be expected, a number of people died there. Their deaths were recorded in an official register, which contained the date of death, the name and age of the deceased, why they died, and importantly, from the Guardian's point of view, to which parish they belonged, and therefore who had to pay their burial expenses. If no one else could be found, liability fell to the parish of settlement of the deceased, or as a last resort, the Union General Fund. From 1868 onwards, most burials were paid for by the Board of Guardians. Workhouses and their associated hospitals became the place where those with chronic conditions were cared for. So when you find a hospital called an infirmary, the odds are that its origins lie in the workhouse system. In the early years, the matron was responsible for overseeing nursing care, which was often carried out by women inmates who were given additional rations of beer or other treats as recompense. With the improvement of the status and training of nurses, reformers turned their attention to conditions in the workhouses, and proper nurses were employed. Romsey's first professional nurse seems to have been appointed in January 1876 at a salary of £20 per annum. Thereafter, the workhouse seemed to have one nurse at a time until 1906. Few of them stayed more than a year or two, and several left, being noted as inefficient or incompetent. However, the pay was so poor that nurse quality were unlikely to apply. Doctors, of course, were paid more than nurses, and most of the local doctors had an appointment with the guardians, either for caring for the sick in the workhouse, for vaccinating children, or caring for the poor in their own homes. As I said, a hospital was built, possibly in 1898. It was called St. Luke's. So if you find a baby born in St. Luke's, Romsey, he or she was born in the workhouse. By the late 1850s, visitors were allowed in the workhouses, and many an upper lady saw the inside of their local workhouse. Following this, occasional treats were arranged for the inmates. These took the form of additions to the fare at Christmas, to entertainment in the house, and at outings to activities in the town. Thus, gradually, attempts were made to keep paupers in the community, whereas originally they had been deliberately separated. Outdoor relief was paid weekly by the relieving officers appointed by the guardians. How much of this was taken to the homes of the paupers and how much they had to collect it from a central distribution point within the parish is not clear. In June 1852, Mr. Nightingale, Florence's father, protested against the payment of relief in public houses. Of those receiving out relief, the 8 old formed the largest group. Also relieved were people with permanent disabilities, such as deafness or being crippled. There were widows and abandoned wives with children to support. Many of these people were long-term recipients. Similar groups are to be found in the workhouse itself. The guardians took the view that those receiving relief owed a debt to the community, and in particular, it could be appropriate for recipients to act as nurses to other paupers. For example, in the 1850s, 2 recipients of relief in the 1850s were asked to attend an aged female at Wellow. Both refused. The doctor stated that the bodily capacity of Widow Pierce was exceedingly good for mere attendance, though the position of her fingers prevented her from being able to lift much. Widow Arter had very good health, although she did have varicose veins in one leg, but no ulcer. Amongst those in short-term need of health were those stricken by illness, often of the husband, but occasionally of wife or child. Some illnesses lasted for years, others for a short time. Illness was the most frequent cause of young families applying for relief. For example, Moses Arthur of Lockerley received 12 and 6 in one payment in 1858 because he had a wife and 4 children. In 1876, Martha Cooper of Nursling, then aged 42, received 2 loaves and 8 shillings cash for herself and her 5 children. By the 1878, 2 of the children had left home and her allowances were reduced. Her need was attributed to illness. The guardians paid for people with mental problems to be housed in asylums, usually the county asylum at Knowle. Before 1886, the distinction between mental illness and mental deficiency was not legally or generally recognized. So there was an element of luck who ended up where. Although in a number of workhouses, the feeble-minded were kept in-house, where they could be employed as servants, for example, in the laundry. In February 1857, Mr. Luttridge of the Commission of Lunacy reported of Romsey that insane and weak-minded inmates, 12 in number, are harmless and tractable and apparently well taken care of and treated with kindness. Before 1886, it could be quite difficult to gain admission to asylum for someone mentally deranged, but after that date, the word of 2 doctors was sufficient, subject to places being found. It is noticeable that far more women than men ended up in asylums. It is easy to be smug about the treatment of paupers under the workhouse system of the 19th century, and certainly there was much in the theory and practice that was reprehensible. It was a more equitable system than that which had preceded it, in that the cost of supporting the poor was spread onto a wider base than that of their immediate parish. As the century proceeded, the roughest edges of the system were ameliorated with the employment of professional nurses to care for the sick. It is also apparent that by the 20th century, punishment and containment were gradually easing into what might be called a social work approach. That said, the shame and humiliation of going into the workhouse remained with those affected, and the abolition of the system in 1948 was seen as a great improvement by many. However, since those heady days 70 years ago, we have still not solved the problem of what to do about the poor, and our current arrangements leave much to be desired. But many of the underlying assumptions of the Victorians about the indigent poor are still prevalent today. I wonder what will happen next. Now, that's the end of the talk. I've been asked a few questions, which I will answer until we run out of time. I've asked if people went in and out of relief and in and out of the workhouse. Yes, they did. Some were permanent, some were had problems at particular times of year. You get occasional families through several generations who keep cropping up. Really, the people who got outdoor relief were much the same as those who got indoor relief, as far as I can see. The old people, more people with children, I think, were out relief than on indoor relief. But part of the problem was Romsey Workhouse wasn't big enough for all its claimants, so that sort of clipped their wings. Did the elderly with dementia end up in the asylum or the workhouse? I've no idea, because it wasn't recognised as a condition. I suspect mostly in the workhouse. The infirmary, initially, they had a medical room in the main workhouse, and then subsequently they built St. Luke's Hospital. I think each workhouse made its own arrangement. Vagrants were what we would call tramps. They were people of no fixed abode who wandered about from place to place, the homeless, moved on by the police. And it was illegal to sleep out overnight. You had to go to, the law said you had to go to the workhouse. They didn't all, of course, but there we are. And the final question I have was, is MH12 a group of documents at the National Archives? To which the answer is yes, it's an enormous group. You get lost there forever, really. Now, I will return this to Barry, if I can work out which make host. So Barry should now be in charge. Are you?
I am. Well, thank you very much, Phoebe. It's a fascinating talk, and I particularly like the bit when the cat caught the mouse, as it were. Very difficult to arrange
it
that.
It managed to get the cable around its neck and ran off with it.
Oh, right.
And then the phone went and the doorbell went.
Right, okay. Well, anyway, after some editing, this talk will be posted on YouTube, where you'll also find a talk by Paul Pinhorn on the Hampshire Genealogical Society. So many thanks to the 50 people who participated in the original version of this Zoom talk. And thank you very much again, Phoebe, for all that work and a very excellent talk on the Poor Law, particularly with reference to Romsey. So goodbye, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Right, thank you for organising it.
That's okay.